Some years ago, a friend of mine in France asked me to give a paper at a conference about the French Jesuit philosopher-historian Michel de Certeau. I thanked her for the invitation, but said that I could not accept it because I really didn't know much about de Certeau. She replied, somewhat indignantly, "That is no problem." When I later reflected upon our conversation, I better understood why I sometimes felt perplexed at papers I heard in academic conferences. When John Borelli asked me to speak at his conference, I replied that although I much revered Newman and had from time to time dipped into his writings, especially the essay on the development of Christian doctrine, I had never studied or even read the idea of a university. John replied in words similar to those of my French friend, and then turned on his charm. I agreed to speak. I stand before you this morning, therefore, not as a specialist in Newman's idea of a university, which I read for the first time in preparation for this morning. I have read virtually none of the secondary literature on the topic. I therefore stand before you to be corrected by those here present who know the work well. I like to think, however, that I am not utterly devoid of credentials. Although I do not know Newman, I have had a long interest in the broader history of schooling in the Western world, beginning in the 5th and 4th century Athens through the Middle Ages down to the present. Within that pretentiously broad scope, I have specialized in the history of Jesuit education, trying to place it within the broader history. If I have anything to contribute to our conference today, it is my attempt to place Newman's work in that broader history. It is a history that scholars have diligently explored since Newman's day, and a history that has developed into a subject about which we know vastly more than was available to Newman. Let us begin by looking at Newman's title, the idea of a university. I think Newman himself might agree that a more accurate title would be the idea of a Catholic university. That is a species of university he was asked to found in Dublin, and that is the species of university that conditions just about everything he has to say in the idea. If we want to place the work in the broad history of schooling, I suggest that an accurate, though long-winded title would be the idea of a Catholic university modeled on the University of Oxford in the mid-19th century. If we accept that title, then we must accept that Newman's university represents a moment in the history of Oxford and Cambridge that sets it apart from medieval universities, from continental universities at Newman's time, and from the universities around the world today. Although in the idea, Newman writes about the Faculty of Medicine, the Faculty of Science, he makes the Faculty of Arts and Letters the real center of his work. He identifies that faculty with the very ideal of universities, in that it is the faculty that tells us what a university is all about and what it was meant to achieve. In so doing, he defines university-style education as liberal education, whose purpose is to produce a gentleman. University, liberal education, and gentleman are to Newman almost synonymous. In other words, a university education is radically student-centered. It wants to produce a certain kind of person, which Newman and his contemporaries described as a gentleman. A gentleman, as Reginald Johnston, the tutor of Puyi, the last emperor of China, said to him in Bertolucci's great movie, "A gentleman, Your Majesty, is a man who says what he means and means what he says." Johnston, aka Peter O'Toole, expressed well the ideal of what came to be called liberal education, as first expounded by Isocrates in the 5th century Athens, by Cicero and Quintilian centuries later, and then by the humanists of the Italian Renaissance. The ideal is to say accurately and precisely what one means and not resort to, you know what I mean. You say what you mean so that others do not guess at what you mean. The ideal had an ethical content, to mean what one said, to be honest in discourse so that one's word itself is a guarantee of truthfulness, an aspect of the ideal of fair play. Understood in this ideal, and I think in Newman, though he does not make much of it in his book, was commitment to public service, commitment to the common good. Isocrates had first articulated that ideal as part of his response to Plato's criticism of the sophists, out of whose school Isocrates came. According to Newman, the university accomplishes its goal through teaching. As we have just heard this morning, at Oxford the primary teachers were the tutors, who understood their role not simply as teaching a subject, but as inspiring an ethos and a life ideal of a devout Anglican. As fundamentally a teaching institution, the university was not concerned with the advancement of knowledge. Teaching is what universities do, and since they do not advance knowledge, they must teach received wisdom. That wisdom was principally embodied in the literary classics of ancient Greece and Rome: Homer, Thucydides, Sophocles, Demosthenes, Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, and the others. Liberal education was essentially a literary education. Newman opposes this education to an education directed to useful knowledge. This education is thus liberal as opposed to technical or professional. I hope I'm interpreting Newman correctly when I say that the students of liberal education, as he describes it, do not need to get a job and earn a living. They are gentlemen of a certain class of society. To the ancient ideal of such an education, Newman adds a new component: theology. In fact, the idea of a university is particularly special in the amount of attention Newman dedicates to that discipline. He first argues that theology is a valid and indeed an essential component of a university because universities, by definition, teach all subjects. I suspect most of us here are ready to grant theology a place in a full university, even though relatively few universities in the world today have a faculty of theology. What is more puzzling for us, at least for me, in Newman, is the seemingly corrective role theology is to play regarding other disciplines in the university. I say puzzling because I could not quite figure out how theology was to play that role, and also puzzling because I have difficulty recalling instances when theological faculties actually played it, or if they did, that the function turned out well. Newman speaks of theology as if it were a part of a traditional liberal education. As Canon Chapman just informed us, students at Oxford were required to take a course in divinity, even if they were not students for the ministry. Newman seems to require the same in his new Catholic university. As far as I know, no university on the continent ever prescribed such a course because theology was a strictly professional discipline. Only in the 1950s in the United States did Catholic educators ask whether there was such a thing as college theology, and if there was, how it had to be modified for non-divinity students. Only in the 1960s did theology courses begin to appear in the curriculum at Georgetown. They replaced courses in religion, that is, catechism, apologetics, and at best, Bible history and perhaps a little church history. Religion was not a critical discipline. Perhaps religion comes close to what was taught undergraduates at Oxford. I really do not know. At a few points, Newman suggests that his program is a kind of update and reformulation of the educational ideals of the long-standing model of medieval universities, especially the University of Paris. As is well known, Paris and Bologna were the first universities founded at almost the same time in the final years of the 12th century. Paris had a prestigious faculty of theology as well as a faculty of arts and sciences, the two essential building blocks of Newman's university. With that, we can now turn our attention to the history of schooling and see how Newman's university fits in that picture. The creation of the university is perhaps the greatest achievement of the Middle Ages. What I find especially startling about that institution is how rapidly, within scarcely more than a generation, it established the goals, the basic structures, and the basic procedures that in their fundamental functions, purposes, and organizational strategy have changed so little over the 800 years since then. I mean things like departments, deans, presidents, faculty privileges and gowns, faculty meetings, set curricula, set examinations, and most especially the conferral of academic degrees such as Master of Arts, Doctor of Law and Medicine, those public certifications of professional competence. Even more startling and fundamental than the university's precocious sophistication is how from its inception, the university already embodied and promoted a set of values that still undergirds universities today. I'm referring to the value and supreme importance of questioning received wisdom and of the necessity of exploring every aspect of the physical world. Possibly a few students went to medieval universities were motivated by a pure love of learning, but the vast, vast majority went to them because they wanted to make a career. We put that less elegantly today when we say students come to a university so that when they finish, they can get a good job. In essence, that is why students have always come to the university. In the Middle Ages, universities had developed 4 faculties, or as we would say today, 4 schools: law, medicine, theology, and arts. The first 3 obviously trained professionals. The fourth, less obviously, but by the middle of the 13th century, it too had professionalized into a school of philosophy, especially natural philosophy, the seedbed of modern science. These 4 faculties operated, as do departments and schools today within a university, as silos, virtually without interaction with one another. Before Aristotle largely took over the Faculty of Arts by the middle of the 13th century, it was the faculty in which the Triduum and the Quadrivium were taught. Its immediate goal seems to have been to perfect students' ability to write correct Latin according to medieval standards, and to learn different modes of computation. It bore virtually no resemblance to Newman's Faculty of Arts and Letters because it did not teach the essential subject, literature. Whatever slight resemblance the faculty might once have had to Newman's faculty, it lost even that when the works of Aristotle became the substance of the curriculum without completely displacing the Triduum and Quadrivium. Not all universities had all 4 faculties, and even when they did, some faculties were larger and more prestigious than others. Paris, as I mentioned, was renowned for theology, whereas Bologna for law. Bologna did not have a faculty of theology until a century after its founding, and even then, it was not much more than a consortium of theologians from the houses of the religious orders in the city. If law was prestigious in Bologna, Natural philosophy was prestigious in Padua, and medicine in Salerno. Theology did not reign supreme in all medieval universities. In Italy, in fact, the theological faculties were small, lacking in prestige, and the faculty ill-paid. For all its sophistication, the medieval university, like its contemporaries today, never articulated an explicit philosophy of education to explain and justify to itself and to others what it was all about. But of course, it operated out of a philosophy. Despite what we are sometimes led to believe, the philosophy of education of medieval universities was essentially secular. By secular, I mean that even though a university might have a papal charter, and even though it might be surrounded by religious symbols and ceremonies, it, qua university, did not concern itself with students' eternal salvation, did not concern itself with playing a constructive role in church or society, and did not concern itself with the student's personal development, religious, ethical, psychological, or emotional. It was secular, moreover, in that successful attendance at a university spelled upward socioeconomic mobility. The first purpose pertained especially to the faculty, the second especially to the students. The two purposes, I need not tell you, are the two on which universities, including a university like Georgetown, operate today. After the founding of the universities of Paris and Bologna, universities proliferated across Europe and became one of the most characteristic of European institutions. The world had never seen anything like them. Although it educated only a minuscule percentage of the population, they enjoyed immense prestige. They were the schools. And thus the teachers came to be known as scholastics, that is, academics. In fact, in that sense, virtually everybody in this room this morning is a scholastic. Sorry. A reaction set in. The literary tradition, which had been the style of formal schooling in possession since the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE until the 13th century, experienced a renaissance, sparked in large part as a reaction to the university. It was no accident that the person most responsible for setting the Renaissance on its way was a literary figure, Petrarch. By the middle of the 14th century, he had already articulated the many grievances against the university that soon became standard. Among them, two were crucial. First, universities did not teach literature and history, which according to those educators were the subjects that illuminated the great questions of life as it is actually lived, and thus helped students deal with them in their own lives. Those subjects treated questions of life and death, of virtue and vice, of greed and redemption. They treated the ambivalence in all human decision-making. They did so not through abstract principles, as found, for instance, in Aristotle's Ethics, but through poetry, stories, drama, and so forth. These were the subjects the Renaissance humanists called the studia humanitatis, which I translate as the subjects that teach what it means to be a human being. The second grievance against the university, closely related to the first, it had no interest in the spiritual, moral, or even physical development of the student. In fact, it tended to corrupt the students by the self-promotional values it inculcated. Getting ahead, either as a student or faculty, seemed to be the university's core value. Unlike the founders of the universities, the humanists of the Renaissance wrote treatise after treatise on their educational project. They drew on the great theorists of antiquity, such as Cicero and pseudo-Cicero. Their program was multifaceted, but it was fundamentally formational. He wanted to produce articulate individuals who said what they meant. He wanted to produce ethical individuals who meant what they said. He wanted to produce individuals with social awareness, with a sense of responsibility for the common good. They, in that regard, like to quote Cicero's line from his De Officiis, "We are not born for ourselves alone, non nobis solum nati sumus." They want to break students' parochial outlook and to open them to broader horizons. They want to prompt them to ask questions, not simply about the technical subject in which they might be interested, but about key questions of life itself. By the 16th century, they managed to found schools dedicated to their goals. The schools went by a variety of names, but for convenience sake, let's settle on college to designate them. These were not prep schools for the university. They were alternatives to the university, institutions based on different goals and different values. They professed, however, to be practical in that they taught basic skills crucial for success in making one's way in the world, especially the skill in saying precisely what one meant and doing so in a mode that was persuasive. They thus professed to produce leaders. Students who finished this program were thus fully educated, not in need of university unless they wanted to be a medical doctor or a lawyer. Descartes, Molière, and Voltaire, for instance, never attended a university. The Humanist College was an institution full and complete in itself. In any case, Renaissance humanists such as Erasmus launched one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in all history and convinced Europe that nobody was truly educated unless educated according to their model. By the middle of the 16th century, Europe had firmly in place, therefore, two rival institutions, two rival models of schooling, utterly distinct from one another, with each going its own separate way. But life is more complicated than theory. While these two models were rivals, they were to some extent also partners. Bit by bit, for instance, universities began to teach literature. Then, in the middle of the century, the Jesuits arrived on the scene in Italy. They bought the humanist propaganda, hook, line, and sinker, as the cliche goes. They saw in its formational goals a parallel with their own formational goals. They set about founding humanistic colleges across Europe and did so in great numbers. In the middle of the next century, they had well over 50 humanistic colleges in France alone. As was their wont, however, they muddied the waters. After all, the 10 founders of the order all held prestigious Master of Arts degrees from the University of Paris. They therefore began also to found a small number of universities. They did so principally for the training of their own members. Like the medieval universities, their universities had an arts faculty, but the resemblance is superficial. The Jesuits' arts faculty was based on the principles articulated by the Renaissance humanists. Its curriculum center was literature. It was, as to be expected, a silo in the larger university structure. We must fast forward. In the 19th century, the universities on the continent underwent a transformation as they developed into research-based institutions, a striking contrast to Newman's idea of a university. By the middle of the last century, the research ideal had fully established itself almost worldwide. In that regard, the universities in the United States today present a special problem. Unlike their counterparts on the continent, All the older and even some of the younger American universities began as fundamentally humanistic colleges, even though some professed to be training ministers. As time went on in the United States, professional schools such as law, medicine, business, nursing, foreign service, and others affiliated with the college to form one institution. Then along came the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, fastened on top of the college. The graduate school constituted a new professionalization of the Studia Humanitatis. The graduate school's aim is to produce professional academics whose badge of honor is proficiency in research, or perhaps better said, proficiency in publication. The aim has had a trickle-down influence on the college, with the result that the fundamental aim of the college is to foster the development of a certain kind of individual. The fundamental aim of the college to foster a development of a certain kind of individual is sidelined, even lost. Moreover, the part of the humanistic schools not incorporated into the university have become secondary schools, getting students ready for tertiary schools, that is the university. They have become, in the full sense of the word, prep schools, as they glory in calling themselves. Prep schools function to enable students to enter into the professionalization education of the university. Even so, some universities in the United States retain more than vestiges of the humanistic ideals of the original college. Georgetown is certainly among them and publicly professes to aim at something more for the students than professionalized proficiency. But it is an uphill battle. After this snappy tour of the history of Western schooling, we can ask ourselves how Newman's idea of a university fits into it. I see it not in the least representing the reality of universities as they have been through their long history from the 13th century to the present. His idea depicts a special and utterly unrepresentative moment in university education. It is not a book to read if you want to know what a university is. As I said earlier, his idea represents mid-19th century Oxford, and I presume Cambridge, which, for better or for worse, were utterly unrepresentative instantiations of universities, even at the time Newman wrote. If we want to fit Newman's book into the broad history of Western schooling, I suggested a more accurate title for it would be The Idea or Ideal of a University. It would not be the idea of a university, but the idea of a humanistic college. That title, in fact, corresponds to most of the burden of the book because he spends most of his time describing the College of Arts and Letters. The problem with the book is its identification of college with university, which is very confusing. Even though it is a mistake to look to Newman for guidance about university education as such, discerning readers can turn to his book for presentation of an educational ideal that even we hardened academics today must in some measure appreciate. We cannot, in today's world, rest satisfied simply with turning out professionally competent people without holding them somehow accountable to standards of human decency and concern for the common good of our race and our common home, the planet. We are not born for ourselves alone. Eloquence, truthfulness, fair play, and concern for the common good seem to be in short supply today in public life. Newman reminds us, educators, of our responsibility to society and to one another in these crucial regards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I want to invite our other two, Canon Chapman and Dr. Aquino, up too. We thought we would begin, as we did before, with a few questions directly to John, and then Dr. Aquino will take over and try to generate some conversation. We are just very, very fortunate to have Dr. Aquino with us today. He was very fortunate because in 2018, he and Benjamin King brought out the Oxford Handbook of John Henry Newman just in time for the canonization. He has several other books on Newman, so we're just delighted to have the opportunity for this discussion this morning on Newman, the idea of a university, and these presentations. So are there questions for Father O'Malley? Such clarity. Such clarity. Please. We have a microphone here.
The other side, Dennis.
Thank you, Father John, for not only going to the bone, but getting in the marrow of that bone, as you so often do. Do you think it is possible today to combine the humanistic character of the collegium, classical collegium, of which you Jesuits are originators in Western Europe, and a university? After 45 years at Georgetown, I'm not sure that it is. I would like you to give me hope.
Yeah. Well, neither am I sure. As I said, it's an uphill battle because, I mean, from its beginning, the university's had two goals. One, intellectual problem solving, AKA production of knowledge, and two, career advancement through the acquisition of technical skills. That's what they were in Paris and Bologna and so forth in the 13th century, and that's what they are today. So that's, when you call yourself a university, it seems to me that's what you're talking about. However, I think that a university like Georgetown does offer some hope in that it's got that strong tradition out of the Jesuit tradition of humanistic scholarship and its perennial value, you might say. It's perennial value. So what do? It seems to me that the best you can do is try to make clear to students that life is, we're about something more than turning out technocrats. We're about turning out a certain kind of individual. And I think that's what Dr. DeGioia does all the time. So you can hardly leave Georgetown and not heard that men and women for others, we're not born for ourselves alone, faith doing justice, personal cura personalis and things like this. So it's difficult. And the humanities, my problem with the humanities is that the humanists, the people who teach them don't really know what they're doing. That they teach them almost as technical subjects, and rather than subjects exploring life's mysteries and life's problems through poetry and drama and so forth. So we had a very interesting lecture here about 4 or 5 years ago by a history professor from a very distinguished university, saying, what about the humanities? What are they supposed to do? And his answer was, they teach students how to think. I thought all subjects taught students how to think. So isn't there something more to the humanities than that? I think that the teachers of humanities themselves are partly responsible for the problem.
This might be for John as well as our other speakers, but so what was the reception theory, or the reception of, I should say, the idea of a university? Obviously, it did not happen as much as I think Newman hoped it would be, but it is an idea, and it's very idealistic. But I was wondering, did it get a good reception, and did it offer ways forward, or was it just kind of basically a kind of held up as an ideal?
I can't answer that.
I could probably say a word about it. In some ways, at the time, it didn't get much of a reception, but it's continued to be read. It's one of the few texts in English on the idea of a university, and therefore it's become foundational for people thinking about what on earth a university is for. So I guess that's the influence. So it's a kind of long afterlife it has. You're the man who knows more about the reception of Newman.
Well, Colin Barr wrote a piece for us in the reception of Newman book, or receptions of Newman. And I think one of the dilemmas we have are historians who, as we've illustrated today, I think both of these papers are historical, giving a lot of really helpful historical information that's the backdrop for Newman's idea. And then you have people like Alistair MacIntyre or philosophers who are more interested in the conceptual aspect of Newman's idea. And it's the idea of a university. And if I think of Newman in the empiricist tradition, which I do, idea would be the association of impressions that are then conceptualized or brought together. And so I think Newman's doing a bit more than merely forming people morally. He's actually has a conceptual idea of what a university is in terms of the nature and the structure. And one of the things he says in the beginning of the text is the purpose of the university is to cultivate the intellect. It's not merely the moral formation or spiritual formation, it's the cultivation of the intellect. And he thinks that's fundamental to all the disciplines in a university. But I guess what I would say is I see a sort of parting of the ways between historians and philosophers in this respect, because the philosophers want to sort of go with the ideal normative account of a university, whereas the historians are wanting to say, well, actually, this was written over a period of time. There are different aspects to it. Newman, as John rightly pointed out, is addressing a particular set of individuals, although I think he has in mind, for example, in terms of evolutionary theory, he's very aware of Darwin. He's very aware of the fact that theologians should not be telling biologists how to teach biology. So it's not that Newman's only speaking to the humanities. He wants, as he says, he doesn't want disciplines to occupy the universe through one perspective. So he's very much against a university being monolithic in terms of one discipline being represented, including theology. I don't think he would ever say theology is in the business of telling us what we should think about the origin of the human species or something like that. And he was not at all, in my estimation, troubled by that kind of question.
Let me butt in for a moment. I mean, you mentioned the cultivation of the intellect. That's a theme throughout the idea. What is that?
It is the formation of what I would call the intellectual virtues that go back to at least Aristotle.
But how do you do that? I mean, he's not clear on how you do it. I mean, I think that for me, the cultivation of my intellect really began in graduate school.
Well, I think you do that by being around people who exemplify what it means to live out the life of the mind, having humility, having intensity of mind. So I take that to be he's in the classical tradition in that respect. Like Aristotle's idea of phronesis. This is something that you learn by being around people, by inhabiting a certain universe with a set of practices. And he actually lays out those practices. Talks about having the kind of mind where you're not overwhelmed by your bias or your immediate perspective or in other words, your prejudice. So I think Newman actually wants to bracket the personal inclinations of the university students, and he wants them to actually think about thinking outside of their own perspective. And in the humanistic quote you had in the paper illustrates that very well. And he in fact says the philosophical habit of mind is the ability to associate things from various perspectives and disciplines and bring them together in such a way that it's synthetic and that it actually shows the relationship between those various disciplines. He actually lays this out in fairly great detail in the idea of university, at least from my perspective of reading it more than a few times. What it means today, I think that's the question I would have, that you rightly point out. In our universities today, it's a very difficult challenge to show students what it means to be truly students who inquire, who learn how to think clearly and carefully about whatever subject matter that they're studying.
I was just going to reflect on if you learnt that at graduate school. I wonder what was happening for the formation before graduate school. Because, I mean, there is a sense in which education begins from the very beginning as soon as one starts engaging with the world outside and the world beyond oneself, then obviously it's a process of education and formation. And there is a sense in which one can't reform the university education without reforming the rest of education. And when does one begin to ask the questions and encourage that in the process of formations? I think that was a fundamental part of Jesuit education from the very beginning.
Right, absolutely. I mean, once you say your first word, you're on the road. But I guess what I mean is that cultivation of the intellect for me means especially a critical sense. And that comes only if you delve deeply into a subject and then deal with those questions. And otherwise, I mean, I had a good, fine training within the Jesuits, but it was not as critical as one encounters in a graduate school. And so, for me, that's the beginning of the real cultivation of the intellect.
We've got several questions.
Okay.
Yes.
So you spoke a lot about, or it has been the moral life and cultivating that as, you know, parallel to the intellectual life. What just occurred to me as you were talking is, you know, this notion of critical thinking is so important. But I think that there's a flip side to that where, you know, it's not so much critical thinking that's being. It's not so much critical thinking as that we're turning out a lot of people who are just judgmental. And that's a problem, I think, and it's a kind of sense that there's got to be a balance between, you know, the idea of going to get an education doesn't mean coming out superior to everyone else, and how to kind of balance that intellectual formation with the moral formation, the sort of rights that go along with being a degree-bearing individual in society, but also the duties that you have to others to sort of lead the way. And that's the sense of leadership by modeling, by example, this humility you speak of. But I think so often today we just see people coming out with advanced degrees and just, you know, thumbing their nose at the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that's precisely why the formation, and I think Mark in his paper, and thank you for giving your papers in advance, starts out by focusing on the moral formation element, but at the end sort of talks about the mutual interaction or interplay between the moral and the intellectual. And I try to tell students we don't want to confuse that, because you can be a really good person, a really nice person, and be wrong. And you can be intellectually virtuous and be a morally suspect person. And I want to say it's possible, conceivable. I think Newman would grant that it's possible to know a proposition. I think Newman is actually interested in propositional knowledge too. Not merely being a moral person and navigating in the world. He actually wants to get at the truth as much as that's possible. And I think Mark rightly pointed out, Newman's a bit more open-ended in that respect. He's open to being corrected. Now, he did a little bit with revision. He really liked to revise his works, and sometimes there's hagiography associated with that. It looks better than it was. But I would want to make the distinction between the moral and intellectual aspects here, and I would hope universities, although I'm with John and Mark, I think we're in a time where it's more important to produce information, publish, be credible, get tenure, and all that kind of stuff. And I would hope we would spend, because both of you at the end of your papers, and I'd like you to address this, seem to lay out some hope, or at least you hope that perhaps what Newman envisioned, which was the internal formation of the individual, that is not merely articulating the right things, but having the right state of mind, which he calls the right habit of mind. So it's a habitual disposition and stance, is important to not only producing or getting knowledge, but actually having a certain persona. Now again, how to prohibit that in university, I don't know. Students go through their stages where, you know, they think they know more than they do, and then graduate school sort of knocks them off the rocker a bit and helps them to realize they don't know as much. And so I don't have an antidote in place to prohibit that kind of what you're describing.
So I guess I have a question. I mean, I teach at a theological seminary, and the tensions between being a professional school, being an academic institution, and being a place of spiritual formation are what we live with all the time, and students inevitably feel like they're getting pulled in one direction at the expense of the others. That just happens all of the time. And so just trying to achieve the integration of all of those things at once, I think by definition is just a very ambitious thing to try to do. When Newman's sort of way of going about that feels to me very much like something that would happen at a seminary, the sort of interpersonal interaction engagement, the sort of tutorial model, the one-on-one, that feels very, very seminary-like to me. And yet there's also this sort of academic formation, as an academic myself and as a layperson that I received in the academy that is slightly different from the theological formation. And then, so I guess the missing piece in all this for me is how theology itself as a discipline fits in the middle of all this. Is theology, because I think at Dublin University, theology wasn't sort of queen of the rest of the university. It was there, but so I guess how to fit theology as a discipline, and we've talked about how just even as a creation, it sort of floats ambiently as well. So how does theology then fit with all of these other pieces?
That was one of the, I'm supposed to be the moderator today, so.
You can carry on.
We like to hear you. We like to hear you. So one of the questions I have for both of you, because you address this in your papers, what do you think Newman's idea of the role of theology was in the university? Was it a meta sort of discipline where it was over the disciplines, or was it, how did Newman fit theology into the idea of a university? And then I suppose your question is more constructive. What does that mean for us today, right? Is that fair? Yeah.
Shall I make a stab at that? It's from somebody whose main job is to teach in a seminary and to wrestle with the idea of the kind of professional school that's training people to do a certain task in a church, and on the other hand, trying to help people understand more about who they are in relation to God. And those tensions are there from the very beginning, and they remain like that. But I think if one is to try and sort of match that up against what Newman is doing, the University of Oxford, when he's there, is a seminary. There is no alternative. That is how you train to be a minister in the Church of England at Newman's time. And there is a sense in which the whole pursuit of learning is part of that training in the pursuit of God. And that's the fundamental. So theology doesn't exist as a separate discipline at all. There are things that you need to know about the nature of the tradition, and that's what's taught. But that's not fundamentally anything you actually get a qualification in. Your qualification is in learning. You get your Master of Arts, and still that's the nature of Oxford's course. You get a Master of Arts, and the idea of the kind of studium generale, the general study of the whole of learning, and before then you're able to move beyond into the study of God per se, is after you've done all this. So it's part of a kind of dispositional pursuit of knowledge, of wisdom, of learning in a much more broad-based curriculum than one might see where theology becomes a kind of specialist discipline alongside the others. In Oxford at Newman's time, sorry to go back kind of the historical, is that the only way of doing theology was to write a dissertation after you'd finished your master's, which was a Bachelor of Divinity. The universities is another sign of the secularization of Oxford. That degree was abolished about 15 years ago now, which was interesting. It had no fees, that's why they abolished it. But anyway, but you did have to have a Master of Arts before you were allowed to do it. So I think it is the cultivation of a habit is a religious duty, and the way. So I suppose it's trying to understand, well, what did Newman then think religion was? And what do people, that whole period, what are they understanding religion to be? Not a set of dogmas and propositions in a kind of scholastic model, a kind of neo-scholastic model. It's very much more a kind of disposition of the will and the understanding, all relating together. So it is that sense of a cultivation of a kind of personality, and a religious personality. And that's why they were very happy with dialogue with the pagans. This is all something that we all do in virtue of being human. I mean, interreligious dialogue is not new when we've started, engaging with religions in other parts of the world. It's there in the very heart of the academic curriculum when one begins to engage with the humanistic writers of the classical world. So there's no anxiety of this because they're all in the pursuit of truth. I mean, the Church of England might have it better than anybody else, but they're in the pursuit of truth. It is there at the heart of what it's about. So I better not carry on, otherwise the lights didn't flicker.
Well, I myself taught in a seminary for 27 years, so I know exactly what your problem is. And as the classics used to say, solvitur ambulando. You can't get a theoretical answer to it. You just have to live with it and try to put it together as best you can. But that's a very special kind of situation. Whereas when you get to a university and finally decide that in a university you're going to have courses in theology or have a theology department, it becomes a silo. I mean, sorry, but that's the way things are. And so, does it have any impact on the university as such? Well, yes, but not in a way that's hard to hard to pinpoint and sort of fully justify.
Yeah, and I think one qualifier in terms of Newman and someone like Aquinas, Newman would agree with Aquinas in this respect, that everything is related to God. And so in a university, either directly or indirectly, all things are related to God. And so biology is not theological in and of itself, but insofar as it's related to the source, and for Newman, I think that is the meta aspect of theology, is that all these things come together as relating to this one thing, either indirectly or directly. So again, I don't think you would want to put a theological stamp on it, but like Mark said, there is this integral aspect to, and again, it's a university that is largely shaped by his Anglican and / Roman Catholic identity. It is not a secular university.
And it's probably worth just mentioning in the context of the idea of the university is in Ireland, which has its Protestant university in Trinity College, Dublin. They're setting up a new university for Catholics to attend, having already set up the Queen's universities, which are these places of instruction and of knowledge acquisition and of testing. They're not places that really offer much by way of a kind of formation and a kind of relational teaching at all. So there is a sense, the context is opposition to the alternative model, which is London University and the Queen's 4 constituent colleges of Queen's University of Ireland, as it was.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm wondering whether Newman at any time questioned, let's say, the basis also of the education in terms of social justice. I mean, it's at times, certainly the socialism, Marx, I guess, hasn't been in London yet, but the industrialization with its effect on the population, and certainly colonialism is very much in place, but given Newman's penetrating pursuit of truth, and we heard it just mean that you are educated to say what you mean, but in particular you're also educated to act on what you mean. Is there anything, I'm not a Newman scholar, is there anything of this kind which might in fact set him apart from all the other thinkers?
Well, not being a specialist in Newman, I'll answer that. As best I can tell, in the idea of a university, one of the subtexts there is, yes, you're a gentleman and you're getting this kind of education for the good of society, for the common good. I think that's at some points explicit and some points implicit, but it's not really a major theme, although I think this was probably very, very clear to Newman and to his contemporaries that that's what they were trying to do. But social justice, no. This is a quite modern idea, and not questioning the very structures of society. So it just goes with the 19th century. I mean, this is not common. So what do you think?
I mean, my own view is to read Newman, certainly the Newman before he becomes a Catholic, to read him in his kind of Oxford movement context. That quote I gave about the dull staid Tory, which it is very important about the kind of social vision, is a vision of a kind of organic society where all people fit together. And it is the responsibility for those in positions of power and authority to look after and to care for those with less power and authority. And a lot of the ways in which that develops is a sort of social vision that's rooted in a rather romantic view of what the Middle Ages were like. And one of the things that Newman is at the very beginning of that kind of romantic Gothic revival, architecturally, but also socially. Absolutely. You can see it far more in Keble, who becomes a parish priest, and in his parish he tries to set up a kind of a medieval vision of caring for the poor, of educating the poor, and of organising society from the kind of top-down model there. But you can see it in people, the Young England movement, which begins in the 1840s with Disraeli and Lord John Manners and people like that, who are very closely connected with the Tractarians, who are there trying to re-establish England on a kind of medieval vision. And we've even had it revived recently with John Milbank, of all people. Yes. There is a kind of clamour for this kind of Christendom model of an organic society where all are cared for because of this social vision that is there at the heart of a Christian understanding of society.
Of course, it has nothing to do with the real Middle Ages, right?
Absolutely. Yes. There's no plague. There's no plague.
Yes.
Thank you. It was suggested that Newman is something like the architect of liberal education, and that liberal education has as one of its central emphases critical thinking. Is that really accurate to Newman? Here's Newman in 1865, at the peak of his intellectual powers and influence. Liberty of thought is in itself a good, but it gives an opening to false liberty. Now, by liberalism, I mean false liberty of thought, or the exercise of thought upon matters in which, from the constitution of the human mind, thought cannot be brought to any successful issue, and therefore is out of place. Among such matters are first principles of whatever kind, and of these the most sacred and momentous are especially to be reckoned the truths of revelation. Liberalism, then, is the mistake of subjecting to human judgment those revealed doctrines which are in their nature beyond and independent of it, and of claiming to determine on intrinsic grounds the truth and value of propositions which rest for their reception simply on the external authority of the divine word. It seems to me that Newman was a thoroughgoing, principled foe of what we call critical thinking. Is he, or am I misreading him?
I guess it depends on the way you define critical thinking, because he clearly in his letters has exchanges with atheists, agnostics. His very good friend was an agnostic atheist. He was not opposed to making arguments and evaluating those arguments on their own merit, while recognizing two people are going to differ with respect to divine revelation. He thinks the likelihood of divine revelation is high, and somebody who thinks it's less plausible, Newman acknowledges the gap between two individuals, but he's not going to blow off that individual just because they don't share his divine revelation. If you just look at his letters, you look at his principles, also on conscience. I gave a talk at Oxford about a year and a half ago on Aquinas and Newman. Newman could be employed by both liberal and conservative Catholics because he does think at some point liberty of conscience actually trumps a papal dictum with respect to certain moral teachings, or not teachings, moral actions, or should I do X or should I do Y? So I would think Newman's not opposed to his, what I would take to be his, all the way back to Butler, Newman's appeal to liberty of conscience, freedom. But I also think he thinks if you have interlocutors and they're saying gibberish, they should be called out for using gibberish. I think he's, if from my perspective, again, we're using a term that we use today to describe a 19th century writer, but I don't think he would be opposed to a critical examination of what he would call central Christian teachings.
He's opposed to it right here. I just read the passage, 1865.
Right, but you can also read other passages in Newman that say almost the opposite of that. For example, he says there are false certitudes, and then he says certitudes are indefectible.
But he's got the attitude of obedience that comes first. So how do you do knowledge on the basis of obedience? And that's one of the struggles. I mean, because he doesn't believe in liberty of thought. He doesn't believe in the freedom for everybody to study. That's quite clear when he's at Oxford. He's deeply opposed to opening up the study for all people, because fundamentally he wants to see the attitude as something upheld by the obedience of a will towards a higher power. And from his point of view at the time, it's obedience to the teaching of the Church of England. So there is a conundrum there, and it's undoubted. I mean, contrary to what some might think, Newman is absolutely no liberal. But Newman does have this sense of which it's about the education of wisdom and the cultivation of the intellect that allows you then to ask questions that might then mean that the obedience that you always thought was correct will be informed in a different kind of way. That's how he eventually ends up by moving away from the Church of England into the Catholic Church. It's because he's informing his own sense of, or his will is changing because what he thinks he's been obedient to turns out to be false. So he's asking those fundamental questions, but he's not doing so in a kind of modern freedom of thought way whatsoever. So that's very consistent with the overall theme of his teaching. But it doesn't stop the university itself being interested in a deeper and a higher kind of pursuit of truth that everybody's engaged in virtue of being human. So he has an understanding of what it is to be human that is sitting alongside his understanding what it is to be a religious believer or a religious one who is obedient to religious truth.
So were scientists free to examine first principles, but not theologians?
I think it would be theologians could examine first principles in certain areas, but not many areas. So I think there is a sort of separation of two views and two understandings.
And such matters are first principles of whatever kind. He seems here to exclude the examination of first principles, which refer to revelation in the divine word. I'm just saying that's not...
Well, let me say something.
The man says what he means and means what he says. So can we address the text?
Well, let me say that in general, religious thinkers in the 19th century did not trust critical thinking because the critical thinkers who dealt with religious subjects tended to be anti-Christian and sort of, so you have Strauss and Renan, people like this. So the First Vatican Council, they didn't want any of this. They were scared to death of German universities where this was raging. So it seems to me that I can't think that Newman was utterly outside that environment. I mean,
But I guess it depends.
Well, no, I mean, certainly he's a human being, so there's critical thinking. But I mean, the modern critical movement in beginning in Germany, but elsewhere, so I can't imagine he was really enthusiastic about that.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is when you read him, let's just say, for example, his understanding of John Locke. On one level, he disagrees with Locke and says, on empirical grounds, your account of belief formation is insufficient. That's what he says in the grammar. He also agrees with Locke's idea of the if you look at of the conduct of understanding in Locke, of the cultivation of the intellect, which is this ability to think broadly and to make these associations. So you have simultaneously a critique of Locke while affirming something in Locke. Whether that happens in the university or not, I think that's an interesting question. But in his own writing, or his writings, at one point he actually is on board with David Hume. He actually is very much on board with David Hume, his rejection of Locke. Newman was in what I would call the British naturalist tradition. He's very much open to taking that tradition and using it critically while recognizing there's going to be the parting of the ways. Also, first principles are not self-evident. They're not self-evident of themselves. They're starting points that are, as Aristotle would say, these are starting points that can't be demonstrated. So we all start with first principles. So there's an external world. I'm in a body. I was born. I'm going to die. But I don't think Newman would say those are self-evident or demonstrative. Those are just taken for granted. And those are the starting points for any intellectual discourse. And people will disagree with respect to those first principles.
That quote could have been written by any self-respecting Anglo-Catholic or High Church writer at the same kind of time. in the Church of England. It's nothing specifically Newmanesque about that. 10,000 clergy tried to campaign against the publication of a book called Essays and Reviews in 1860. And it's extremely typical of the kind of normal approach to the religious thinking at the time. So there's nothing specifically Newmanesque about that. But that didn't mean that they weren't interested in the cultivation of the intellect at the same time. So it may just be the inconsistency of mid-Victorian thought that's a demonstration of.
Thank you. Father O'Malley has really pointed us to the centrality of the notion of the gentleman in the idea of a university, and that's something that strikes me as well, as both a really important figure of a kind of ethos, but also a really problematic figure in the way that it's gendered, it's classed. It may, in the 19th century context, it may very well be implicitly raced. Giving these lectures in Ireland, there's a notion that it's aspirational in a quasi-colonial situation. And I guess what I'm wondering is whether what we do with the figure of the gentleman in the idea of the university today, do we just make the sort of the table of gentlemanliness bigger and invite more people into gentlemanliness, or is it not really severable from Newman's notion of the university, and that it's a fundamental problem in its grounding in 19th century notions of gender and class and race?
Well, I think that, obviously, the 19th century English gentleman is a very specific instantiation of an ideal, and it has, as you pointed out, all its kinds of its limitations. But I think the central point of it is, like the central point of humanistic education in general, is to be articulate and to be trustworthy, that your word is your honor, and that you do have concern for the common good. Now, that differs from generation to generation. As we said, they had no conception of social justice, which was just beginning to germinate with the abolition of slavery and things like this. So it seems to me that is what we all educators, all of us educators, need to be aware of and striving for, no matter what we're teaching. And that's not common in most universities today. I mean, that ideal, I like to think that at Georgetown, in this very limited way and so forth, does hold up that ideal very imperfectly. But that seems to me that's where the ideal of the gentleman makes sense.
It's to take the context seriously is absolutely crucial, and Oxford is an all-male, all-Anglican institution educating people for a particular class. It is occasionally an agency of a movement between classes, but effectively that's what it is, and one has to wrestle with that and the whole nature of elites at that time. I was talking to somebody at the break about how this played out in education across the British Empire and the establishment, not really of universities, but of schools, because the English, as we call them, public schools, the private school system as it was developing at exactly the same kind of period under the influence of people like Thomas Arnold, another fellow of Oriel College actually at the same time as Newman, is very much the cultivation of the boy into the man through the critical cultivation of character. So you're beginning to get them to ask the questions so that they will mature into manhood. And the gendered characteristic of that is very important. And the model that was then implanted by others into female education on the same kind of model followed that idea of the growth into maturity. But that model is quite often implanted in the schools that develop for colonial administrators, particularly in India, And there is the humanistic ideal becomes extraordinarily important in the beginnings of, because basically they failed to convert anybody, the missionaries, so they set up the schools, and those schools are there to educate people into a kind of human ideal, and to work out what that human ideal is, and to try and connect that with the whole sort of baggage that's there with race, particularly with English imperial or British imperialism as it established itself, is what colonial historians are doing at the moment. And those questions are enormous. There are no straightforward answers to them about how they approach the other in the cultivation of the character, which they see as a human ideal. But human ideals are obviously rooted in time and place. So there's that, one of the engagements with critical history is that one will be exploring those kinds of discussions. So Newman is a man working in a man's world, and that's very important. It's interesting if one looks at the representation of people here. It may say something about the nature of that world that still persists into the future.
I have a question. So given the topic of this conference, the impact of Newman, if I'm correct, that's the focus, right? So what, from your perspective, because I think you both gave really good historical accounts, and I think, as you know, history is not a normative discipline in the following way. It's not telling you how you ought to believe or how you ought to think or how you ought to live. What's the impact of Newman's idea of a university, given all the caveats and distinctions you've made, for today? Is there? Because I kind of get the sense we can historicize Newman in such a way that he becomes a really interesting relic. In fact, that's one option. Let's just sort of treat him as a relic, and I know in certain circles relics are important. They're valued, right? And in some, they would say that they're irrelevant.
It's for saints.
right. He's a saint, right? So is this just an opportunity for us to kind of glorify Newman as a saint, or does he have any conceptual relevance for the modern or contemporary university?
Well, I thought I was clear on this, that I think he has tremendous relevance in that he holds up this ideal, this obligation really, to try to not simply produce technocrats, not simply produce people who are can manufacture good careers for themselves, but people who have some sense of human decency and concern for common good. And these are ideas that are not professed by universities today. And I think they need to be professed, because otherwise, well, as Canon Chapman said, I mean, the situation we're in today, the honesty and ability to say what you mean and concern for the common good and so forth, they're in short supply in public life. And universities have a responsibility in that regard.
I mean, if I can just take it slightly further, is that Newman is asking the big question, like many others at the time, what does it mean to be human, and how do we help people become human? That's what education is for. And I suppose it's that any educational task is going to be focused on that kind of question. And one of the important things he does is to articulate that explicitly. And one of the things we're not doing is to articulate that explicitly. But then the problem becomes for us much more about the notion of the common good. It's a nice term, it's used quite regularly, especially in the Roman Catholic world. But who's common good and who defines the common good? And that becomes one of the overarching problems, is in a pluralist kind of society, who decides what the common good is, and where that's itself becomes a contested discipline, and where what it is to be human is a contested, not contested discipline, but a contested thing altogether. And so there is that sense of how do we negotiate our society and our education institutions in order that there can be debate around what constitutes the common good. So how do we go about constructing a good that is there for all? whoever they might be, as members of that society? Where are the boundaries? How do we draw those boundaries? What's in, what's out? All of those questions are fundamentally what's being asked today, but they're being asked in a very often an inarticulate kind of way. So it's big questions about what common good is. And in a world where there is no overarching sort of religious worldview or whatever, there's contestation and constant contestation. So how do we negotiate common good in a pluralist environment? Newman is living pre-pluralist, sort of pre-pluralist. How do we now do that? The same kind of goals we might have, but we're in a very different world. So I've got no answers.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that was behind my question. I think you were clear in your paper, John, but I also got the impression you didn't think that Newman was relevant insofar as the current university in terms of the way the natural sciences are operating. So is there any ray of hope for the university to incorporate into its system practices by which these individuals are learning to acquire mastery of certain skills and information to also be formed in any way? Because I think that's maybe what I was getting at, is maybe what Newman's thinking is, I got to think when you're in a lab and you're in a research program, you're taught certain things, right? Certain skills or certain virtues of the scientific method. At least when I've taught with physicists, there's a certain protocol. Is there any way to incorporate Newman into that without being blind or oblivious to the fact that most universities are probably heading in a different direction?
Well, I think this is where there's something to be said for a university that's in a religious tradition, and especially one, I mean, like Georgetown, that has a long Jesuit tradition. It's trying to hang on to by the skin of its teeth, but it's got those ideals there. So it seems to me that in that kind of a situation, there's some hope that you can promote these goals. But that's about all I have to say.
But in a secular university, I mean, most of our universities in England have no religious tradition whatsoever.
Right.
They're established mainly either by municipalities or after the Second World War by the governments at the time to expand education, usually without a theology department at all as part of the university. So, and often because that was too contested a discipline to have, and people couldn't agree what that theology ought to consist of, so they just left it out altogether. So you've got a completely secular kind of, but education there was something that was seen to be a general good for the good of society. And my problem is, what is the good of society when that itself is something that's so contested? And that you can see in political discourse all over. There's a clamour for some kind of commonality, but often that's defined over and against others or by limiting universality about what it might mean to be human.
I agree with you. I must say, though, that I think that there are certain things that we could, I think honesty, truthfulness is a fundamental value that at least theoretically people would agree to. Mm-hmm. And agree to the fact that we are not born for ourselves, that we do have some responsibility to other people. I mean, to one's spouse, to one's children, and then beyond that to the environment in which one's spouse and one's children are growing up. So I think it's not just totally up for grabs.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. 2 weeks ago, we had the rector of the Irish College here, and he gave a lecture on Archbishop, later Cardinal Paul Cullen, who had invited Newman to found this university. And then it came out that Cullen got a little impatient with Newman and eventually sort of ushered him out of that position. For one reason, he was spending too much time in England. He wasn't back in Ireland managing the university. How long did the university survive after Newman's departure? Do we know?
Well, it's kind of still there. You know.
It's still there, but didn't it go through a sort of,
It went through a transformation.
yeah,
It's a Beatty thing, though.
UCD, you're referring to.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
University College Dublin, good. Well, thank you.